Hi guys, and welcome to my very first ever tier list. This of course is going to be for the multiplayer part of Total War Warhammer 2. Now, I'd like to point out we are going to be doing this in the standard format of our ranking system from S down to A, B, C, D and F, S being the top and F being the bottom. Now at the end of the video there will be a big old graph to show where I have indeed placed factions. We're going to be going through them one by one to start with. Now I'd like to point out before we do get into this, tier lists in my opinion are incredibly subjective. Yes, I've attempted to be as objective as possible, looking at matchups, the rosters, styles of play, diversity in a faction and all that good stuff, but a lot of this is down to personal experience. I've hosted a lot of tournaments, I've done quite a lot of research into this, but still it does come down to your subjective playstyle. And if I say a faction is bad and you enjoy playing them and you think you win a lot with them, that is completely fine. I'd also like to hear, different people's feedback and ideas on what factions they think are good and bad. Of course, a lot of stuff affects this. The game is regularly updated as well, which does change matchups quite quickly. Map, skill, luck are just some of the different factors that can vary a matchup greatly. There are no terrible or unwinnable matchups in my opinion in this game, which is a massive shout out to CA all round and a fantastic job trying to manage such a crazy game. But anyway, here we go. We are going in with the Beastmen to start with. Now the Beastmen, these fearsome folk, maybe not too fearsome, unfortunately for them. They are one of the earliest DLCs, and they do kind of struggle because of that. In my opinion, they only have one strong character, and that is Morga the Shadowgave, at least when it comes to a competitive sense. Now, the mighty Kazrak One-Eye and the Beast Lords in general have been improved in recent patches and updates, but unfortunately them and Malagor do lack the punching power of Morga the Shadowgave. I don't think he's even that incredible compared to lords from other factions, but yeah, only having one competitive legendary lord, and mainly just because he can summon Chaos Spawn, isn't going to boost you up too highly in my opinion. They only have one strong matchup as well, which is against the Dawi, and this is mainly due to the chariot abuse, and that's more of a weakness in the Dawi roster than a positive in the Beastmen. The mass chariots, Cygors, Bestigors can all be useful tools up against those little armoured stunties. It's only one good matchup, not looking so good so far for the Beastmen. They also lack quite a lot of leadership, and this is a big problem. Low leadership is nothing new between factions. There's a lot of factions which do lack leadership, but it certainly affects Beastmen the most. And that is because a lot of their large, heavy hitting damage dealers are big monsters. And they either end up isolated because the smaller troops do flee in all directions in a big old blind panic, or the big monsters themselves don't have great leadership and they themselves get surrounded and broken off the field, and the Beastmen tend to get scattered and then come in drips and drabs. Apart from that, they're a pretty limited playstyle, mainly having to focus on rushing their opponent as quickly as possible with a mixture of cheap troops as well as heavy hitting big monsters. Now you can play the skirmish game, it is entirely possible, but very risky, and they're not the most fantastic faction at doing it. You can play the artillery game to a point. As you can see in this matchup on the screen right now, we have gone double Cygor, but again, this is incredibly risky. If my opponent had brought a couple of cannons, we definitely would have been shut down and finished off for good there. So not particularly great in the playstyle factor either, and all round they're basically a poor man's Norsca, which hurts my Beastmen hard. I've been kind of bashing on them quite a lot here, and I really love Beastmen from a thematic point of view and a story point of view, but they really do need some love. Norsca can basically do everything the Beastmen are good at, but far better. They're better at rushing, they have better monsters thanks to Famir and Skin Wolves, and they have better range options as well with javelins and throwing axes and so forth, and far better lord options with Wolfric and Frog. So poor Beastmen, not looking too good. So let's see where we have indeed placed them on the list. So guys, unfortunately the Beastmen do come down onto tier F, which is the lowest tier on the list. And if we do a quick recap here, only one competitive lord, only strong against one faction, the Dawi, low leadership, and a limited playstyle which heavily relies on summons. The only time they used to be really competitive in the tournament scene is when you summoned mass Mantigores and Cygors, and summons have indeed been nerfed, costing a bit more Winds of Magic. So that their kind of main go-to in tournaments has dragged them down now, and they're basically a poor man's Norsca, so not too good for the Beastie Boys. Hopefully they do get improved in recent new DLCs and patches to come. But anyway guys, on to the next faction. So up next, guys, we have the brave and heroic forces of Bretonnia. Now, Bretonnia, unlike the Beastmen, have two fantastic Lord options, one in the Fey Enchantress and the other in King Leon Kerr. Not only are they both fantastic lords in their own right, but they are completely different from one another, which gives you some nice variety. The Fey, one of the most slippery devils in the game with incredible abilities and healing. That Mortis engine effect coming in really handy. And King Leon Kerr, being one of the most tankiest, hard-hitting lords in the game, is some pretty scary stuff. So Bretonnia straight out of the gate looking pretty strong. They also have Questing Knights, which are arguably the best knights in the game. And that is because they have pretty good dual purpose all round. Overall, Questing Knights have fantastic anti-infantry, but also decent stats and staying power up against enemy cavalry, and this is heavily supported as well by the Peasant Bowman Archers. Now, Peasant Bowmen have always been relatively good staple in the meta, but because of the changes to poison way back in the day, I think a few patches ago, that it no longer affects friendly troops, poison arrows combined with hard-hitting knights really opens up so much possibilities for the Bretonnian faction, who used to, in my opinion, be as low as the Beastmen, but because of this simple change have skyrocketed up way higher than they ever were before. So that combination of knights and poison is certainly looking good for Bretonnia all round. Overall as well, they have a slightly stagnant playstyle. It's a little bit predictable all round and a little bit limited. Normally you don't get to see heavy infantry builds, just as I say that of course, we do get to see some of their more elite troops, foot squires and battle programs in action, but generally you will see just a sway of peasants being used to slow down the enemy, poison arrows as well to unleash hell upon them, and then cavalry to cycle charge. So a little bit limited in style of play, not the greatest range options as far as artillery goes in real long range, and not the best as well for heavy infantry builds, but still not the most stagnant of all factions, but it is a little bit of a downside for those bad boys. They're also incredibly micro-intensive, at least in a competitive sense. So normally you can't really box in too well with the forces of Bretonnia. You need to use your cavalry very effectively, and they are pretty expensive, at least compared to the peasantry force or contingent of the Bretonnian force. So having to use that good micro, keep your characters alive, and keep your knights nice and healed and topped up can be really tough. So I don't think Bretonnia is a good faction at all for newer players. But we're looking at this from more of a competitive sense when people have really good micro. Bretonnia certainly can strike fear into the heart of the enemies. And look at the glorious Green Knight. How can you not love such a faction? So anyone who does love heavy cavalry is going to love the forces of Bretonnia. But where do they sit on our tier list? Let's have a nice quick little look. So guys, super quick roundup here, but Bretonnia are going to be in Tier C, doing far better than their Beastmen counterparts. They have two fantastic Lord options in the Fey and King Leon Kerr. Yes, they do lack a bit more diversity in their basic Lords, but their Legendary Lords do pack a glorious punch. Question Knights, arguably the best cavalry in the game, are going to be up there as well as a huge reason why Bretonnia are kind of climbing up the ranks from where they used to be, and that combination with poison arrows really helps them out massively. I can't stress how much that has changed the Bretonnia style of play, but also how effective they are. Now, we did speak on some of the downsides of them. They're incredibly micro-intensive, really hard for newer players, but microed well, they can really scare pretty much any faction in the game. Slightly limited playstyle, they can be a bit predictable. You know the heavy hitters are going to be the knights, so your opponent can prepare for them to try and drag them down, which is a little notch as well, which kind of pulls Bretonnia down just a little bit. But still, Tier C, far better than they have been in previous patches and before the recent DLCs. Anyway guys, on to the next one. So up next, we're going to be taking a little look at the Dark Elves. Now, the Dark Elves have some very powerful character options all round. They have some fantastic legendary lords. Morathi and Malekith have always been big staples in the multiplayer scene, but they also have some pretty useful heroes in the form of assassins, and the relatively new masters with their anti-large gives them a good selection that can be useful in different situations. So their characters are certainly a big boon for the Dark Elf forces and put them in good stead straight away. They also have mostly even matchups, no truly terrible matchups, but equally no fantastic ones either, where they dominate pretty much every single game. So relatively even and well balanced where matchups are concerned. Overall though, they probably are slightly unfavoured in more than they are slightly favoured, but nothing too drastic on the matchup front, which is nice to see. It kind of does prove a really good balanced affair all round for the rather edgy elves here. They do have a good variety in units and monsters. As you can see on the screen now, we have flying units, we have big scary monsters, we have damage dealers, cheap infantry troops, good skirmish, cavalry and range. Means they've got a little bit of everything, which is quite nice. Makes them a little bit flexible when it comes to matchups in general, but also your opponent has a little bit of guesswork in knowing what exactly you are going to be bringing with your ridiculous number of options. But I think the kind of backhand of that same point is a lot of their options are incredibly expensive. They have some fantastic heavy infantry, but heavy infantry in general tends to struggle a little bit up in Total War Warhammer. So a lot of your expensive troops all of a sudden then limit you to either taking really elite builds, which can struggle quite a lot in this game, or you have to go cheap and cheerful with just 1 or 2 dotted in the mix. So the expensiveness does kind of drag them down a little bit, and it does make them slightly more kind of streamlined and predictable. There's certain units you don't really ever get to see, much like their two-handed greatsword units, and even the Black Guard are chosen now and again, but they're so risky. If someone has brought a large amount of magic, banishments, pendulums, then all of a sudden you're going to lose and start leaking a ton of value straight out of the gate. Because of this, one way Dark Elf players have countered this in the past is going incredibly skirmish focused. Dark Riders are one of the best skirmish cav in the game. Fast moving AP is pretty scary, and this did leave the Dark Elves really high up on the tier list to start with in previous DLCs and so forth. But players have slowly started to cotton onto this. Dark Elves are so expensive, they're mainly forced to go into the skirmish game. When they do go into the skirmish game, they're not actually the best at it. A lot of their troops, of course being elves, are incredibly squishy, and therefore a lot of opponents can just out-skirmish their enemy. Matchups which used to be Dark Elf favoured, like Dark Elves versus Lizardmen, all of a sudden become way more even because Lizardmen simply outshoot the Dark Elves. And I've seen this in matchup after matchup, where the Dark Elves simply get shot off the board, and this is a massive downside to them and has really dragged them down in recent times, which is a little bit scary for our edgy elves here. So let's have a little look to see how they have indeed performed in my tier list. So guys, Dark Elves all round do struggle a little bit. I'm feeling them slightly still in a festive mood and being a bit generous. We are going to pop them into tier C, although they are very on the borderline for tier D. Now, Dark Elves, I know a lot of you guys out there are going to be a little bit shocked by this one. It may be a controversial positioning of them, as a lot of people think they're very powerful. And I do agree in some aspects. As we said before, powerful character options, relatively even matchups, and a good variety of units. But the combination here of the expensiveness, which forces them often to take skirmishers, otherwise your troops really have to do fantastic in all aspects of the battlefield to make their money back, really forces them to go to a skirmish playstyle. And a lot of factions will just simply out-skirmish Dark Elves. They have more cost-effective skirmishers. Greenskins, for example, can just take a ton of Wolf Riders, Spider Riders, easily beat back the Dark Riders, and all of a sudden those expensive core units for the Dark Elves are simply going to get kited, surrounded, and slowly put down to the sword. So Dark Elves just about clinging on to tier C, in my humble opinion. On to the next one. Up next, guys, we're going to be taking a little look at the mighty Dwarven folk, and the Dwarves are certainly one of my favourite factions, 100% thematically, and even playing them can be some really good fun. So how do these brave warriors of the holds stand up in my tier list? Well, to start with, Dwarfs have some incredibly powerful matchups where they absolutely dominate. Vampires, for example, Dwarfs will simply shoot off the field. Equally, they do fantastic against Empire and Wood Elves. So really good start for the Dwarfs in that aspect. But likewise, they do have some terrible matchups where they struggle so much up against Beastmen, High Elves, and so forth. A lot of factions which have chariots can really quite easily abuse the Dwarven forces. And yeah, so it's a bit of a mixed bag. They're not particularly a well-balanced faction all around the Dwarfs. They have some okay matchups, but a lot of them teeter heavily back one way or the other way very heavily, which is both a good and bad thing for our little boys here. Overall as well, Dwarfs do have a relatively predictable style of play. They don't have any skirmish units, they're incredibly slow for the most part. Of course we do have Slayers, but you don't want a full army of Slayers, it's just not going to be too good, you'll get shot to pieces. So they have to turtle, and they are one of the best factions in the game for turtling. Fantastic firepower from cannons, thunderers, and so on. But it is, again, predictable. You know what you're going to get when you go up against the Dwarves. It's going to be a grind, it's going to be a turtle, but you can force your way through. Now, experienced Dwarven players, much like the Beastmen, do have more styles of play and can experiment a little bit more, but it is incredibly risky and hard to pull off, so for the most part they are relatively limited in that aspect. However, their troops are one of the most cost-effective in the game. Miners with blasting charges can do fantastic burst damage to other light infantry. Dwarf warriors and longbeards can hold for an absolute age. Longbeards in particular being one of the greatest infantry units in the game for points to cost ratio, in my humble opinion, and that really allows them to get value out of other units from Thunderers, Quarrelers and so forth, who can simply sit back behind a mighty dwarven shield wall and unleash hell upon the enemy. The last point I'm going to make about the Dwarfs here is they can be relatively easily abused, which is a bit unfortunate for them. We touched on it earlier, but single entity cycle charging, as well heavily and particularly chariots, can just cycle charge dwarfs to death, and there's not too much they can do now. The recent changes to mass have helped them out slightly, particularly with giant slayers and dragonback slayers. They can now hold the line far better than they ever could before, but if you still get a couple of units of line chariots of Therese charging through, there is very little that the dwarven folk can do. So there is a bit of a big kind of heavy weakness in their thick armor there, is they can be abused by cycle charging, and pendulums and so forth are pretty hard to dodge as dwarfs because you are relatively slow, and that is going to be a big minus for the dwarven folk here. So let's have a little quick look to see how they did do on our tier list. So guys, dwarfs are going to appear in tier B, a really good showing by those guys. So super quick roundup here, some amazing matchups, some terrible matchups, pretty predictable in the style of play, but incredibly cost effective and easily abused. Now, the dwarfs in general, I think, could do with a tiny bit of love. Of course, you do have gyrocopters, but apart from that, they really struggle with map control, and map control is huge in Total War Warhammer. But despite this, because of how cost effective they are and some very strong matchups, they're going to be a very solid tier B option for me. Absolutely love the dwarfs thematically. Some of the coolest lords in the game: Grumble the White Dwarf, Ungrim, who's been massively improved recently, and Belagar is really good cost for value as well, being pretty cheap. So all round a little bit predictable, but a really solid core to their builds. Hope you guys enjoyed the Dawi. On to the next one. Up next, guys, we have arguably the most versatile faction in the game, the Mighty Men of the Empire, and nothing sums them up quite like their legendary lords. They have a huge selection of awesome, powerful lords. We have Volkmar the Grim, as you can see on the screen, who's an incredibly powerful support character who also hits like a truck. And we have Karl Franz, the out-and-out duelist damage dealer who can fly around the battlefield. And you have Marcus Wolfhard, who's a more skirmish-focused lord. Overall, their generic lords do struggle a little bit compared to other lords from different factions, but it's more than made up for in their legendary selection. So I think as far as lords and heroes go, they're in pretty good stead. Now, the heroes, again, are slightly worse than your basic average characters from other factions. The basic captain and warrior priest do lack a little bit, but still their mages are absolutely fine, and the legendary lords more than make up for the lack of generic characters all round through the faction. Now, much like their lords, Empire have an incredibly diverse roster, and that allows them to be very diverse in their styles of play and tactics all round. You can go heavy cav, you can go relatively elite infantry, that is perhaps one area where they lack slightly. You can go very skirmish focused, very gun focused, very defensive and turtle based. The possibilities with the faction of the Empire are just simply endless. And because of this, they only really have one terrible matchup, which is the mighty Dwarfs. Dwarfs simply outshoot the Empire, and the Empire don't quite have enough punch to drag through, but even that matchup isn't the worst in the game, and there's plenty worse from more factions, so having one terrible matchup isn't the end of the world. At the same time, because of their diversity and the fact that they are good at everything but masters of none, they don't particularly have many fantastic matchups going for them. The Vampirates probably being the closest that they have to a big advantage. Apart from that, they tend to come out relatively even, and it's a little bit more of the luck of the dice of which style of play you and your opponent want to go. So the fact they are Masters of None does hammer them home a little bit. There's factions which will outshoot them, factions which will outgrind them, factions which will out-cavalry them, but all round it does open up many different possibilities and styles of play, which leaves the Empire in pretty good stead, in my opinion. So let's see where I have indeed placed them on the list. So guys, all round, the Mighty Empire are going to be coming in at a tier B, which is pretty impressive stuff for them for sure. They have a fantastic amount of good Lord options. Not the greatest in the game, but still pretty solid, despite the fact that generic Lords are a little lacking. Incredibly versatile roster, arguably the most versatile in the game, and that allows them to have a versatile playstyle. Only one terrible matchup, few great matchups, and they are the masters of nothing, unfortunately. Apart from their own fates and destiny, of course. But still, tier B puts them in a pretty good stead. And yeah, again, you know, Skirmish Cav, Pistoliers and so forth, not the best in the game, but they can be used. Great Swords, not the best heavy infantry in the game, but can be used, and so on. And that basically sums up the Empire faction in a nutshell. But because they don't hammer anyone huge amounts, I can't put them above tier B. Alright guys, on to the next one. Up next is going to be the mighty Greenskins, the War. Now, the Greenskins, straight out of the gate, probably have the best Lords and Heroes selection of any faction in the game. Every single one of their legendary Lords, including Grimgor, is relatively good. Now, of course, some of them are slightly better than others, but they have such a good selection for a multitude of matchups. The basic Lords as well, like the Great Goblin Shaman, as well as this Goblin Big Boss right here, are pretty damn fantastic, and their heroes are so goddamn useful. It's pretty scary stuff for sure when you do look at that top end of their roster. They have a little bit of something for every single matchup, some of the best characters all round. Something as well that I think people heavily underestimate in the Greenskins is their cheap Dakka lines. Greenskin Dakka lines are deadly. They work in a similar way to Bretonnian Dakka lines in the fact that they're incredibly cheap, for the most part, their range, and it's sheer volume, so going for quantity over quality in the missile department. But at the same time, Greenskin archers are okay melee combatants, which makes them a little bit tougher to shut down for the most part, and all the heavy, scary Greenskins that are rushing you in the face, it's going to make it a little bit tricky for you to really get into that back line and shut them down. So honestly, some of the best range in the game, simply due to how either fast the skirmishers are, or because it's so cheap and hard to break down that back line formation. Overall, Greenskins are an incredibly flexible faction as well. They can have good skirmishers, good monstrous infantry all round, and even go toe-to-toe with either loaded cheap troops, and artillery is not too dreadful. We have Doomdiver catapults, which can do really fantastic work, and even the Goblobbers as well for a nice cheap option of long-range power. The only thing they can't really contest is their air game, but you do have Azag, the Slaughterer, who can fly on a mighty Wyvern, who can at least contest it to a point, but it is one of the sections where they are in fact lacking. They are one of the best rush factions in the game, probably joint top with the legendary Norsca. They're so good at swarming, they're quick, they can get in back behind your lines, and they have so many tools to do so in the form of squigs, sneaky units which can vanguard like skulkers and so forth. It's pretty terrifying all round to face the power of the War. Now, one other element they are lacking in, apart from the flying kind of tools at their disposal, is their cavalry. So Skirmish cavalry, absolutely fantastic, top notch, very good value for money. But overall, Boar Boys in general, as far as heavy cav go, are a little bit lackluster compared to other rosters throughout. As we can see over here, they're really struggling here to pin in a Ferromanticore, but even these bad boys have been significantly improved in recent patches and DLCs, so nowhere near as bad as they once were. So that's kind of a nice little band-aid over in one of the very few limits in their roster. So let's have a little look to see where I have placed them on the mighty tier list. So as you can see, guys, Greenskins are at the top of the pile. They are up into tier S, the highest rank you can get. So to summarise very briefly, a ton of powerful Lords and Heroes, arguably the best in the game. Incredibly cheap Dakka, which is a gun line. They're flexible, they have monsters, skirmish, swarm, a little bit of everything. They're one of, if not the best rush faction in the game. Only really competition for that is Norsca. And the only super weakness is a kind of lack of flyers and not the best heavy cavalry in the game, but it is still relatively decent. So I think this is the first faction we've actually put right at the very top, particularly from the last DLC they had where Grom came in. I think the Greenskins are incredibly scary, and we're definitely going to see them played in tournaments for the foreseeable future. I think them and an unnamed faction, which will come up later, have been a staple in tournaments for a long time, and I think they will continue to be so for, a while just yet. So on to the next one. Up next is the regal and glorious forces of the High Elves, and straight away you can see the High Elves don't really have too many terrible matchups, which is really good news for them and makes them a pretty good first choice. So in tournaments, they're normally based on a pick and ban system. So you'd pick a faction, ban two, and then your opponent would pick. And I think the High Elves are a relatively safe pick because there's not too many factions which can counter them. Now, all round, they do struggle slightly more against rush factions. You can get into their back line pretty quickly, and at the same time, they do struggle to deal with large entities, which may seem like a bit of a surprise. As you can see here, we have the Phoenix Guard, some of the best anti-large infantry in the game, and they have a plethora of archers, Sisters of Avalon, Eagle Claw, Bolt Throws, and so on, that can take down large creatures, but unfortunately for the forces of the High Elves, all those monsters can push through the Elves formation, as they are Elves. They're not, stout dwarfs low down to the ground. They're a little bit flimsy and can get pushed around pretty quickly and effectively. So they do struggle in that department a little bit. Apart from that, they have some very fantastic matchups, which works really well in their favour. Up against the Dwarfs, they are very mighty and scary indeed, but that is mainly due to the Dwarfs' weakness of chariots, where the High Elves can really exploit. They have some of the best chariots in the game in the form of white line chariots, as well as nobles on chariots, which have been known to abuse Dwarfs from time to time. So they've got a really good matchup there. They're also very potent and deadly up against the forces of the Wood Elves. Lothran Seaguard, real standouts in that matchup. So overall, they have a pretty flexible roster. They can do a little bit of everything, and because of that, they don't really have the bad matchups that other factions do sometimes have. All round for their Lord choices, not the best Lords in the game, but they have some incredibly powerful mage characters. Teclis, Alari L, and Archmages are really, really fantastic. Some of the best caster lords in the entire game. They do lack that real hard-hitting kind of characters. Yes, they have Imric the Dragon Prince, but he's very expensive and has to basically carry a game on his back if you are going to win. And Tyrion can be slightly lackluster. Despite the fact I really love him as a character, I don't think he's anywhere near as good as some lords other factions have to kind of deal damage. They don't have that fantastic assassination character, apart from Imric, but he is unfortunately disgustingly expensive. They have some glorious dragons and really cool thematic looking units all around the High Elves. They do suffer from the elf syndrome of being very expensive and slightly squishy, much like the Dark Elves and Wood Elves do, but all round they're relatively well balanced. So let's see where I place them on my list. As expected, they are going to be coming in at Tier B. Very solid all round. They have no dreadful matchups whatsoever, but they do struggle versus large and rush factions. So a slight weakness to people like Greenskins and Norsca, who are relatively popular as well in the tournament scene, which is a little bit of a struggle for the High Elves all round. They have some very favoured matchups, Dawi and Wood Elves for example, and incredibly powerful caster lords, pits them kind of above a lot of other factions, at least in that department, and they are very flexible, mainly due to no dreadful matchups and a nice complete roster. So all round, High Elves, pretty competitive. Some people rate them quite lowly, but in my humble opinion, they're up there in Tier B, really solid in the mid-ground, but nothing too spectacular. So on to the next one. Oh yes, it's time. My favourite faction in the game, the mighty Lizardmen. Now, how do my favourite Dino boys fare? Well, straight out of the gate, completely unbiased, they are definitely the coolest faction in the game. Dinosaurs riding dinosaurs, you simply cannot compete. But how do they fare on my tier list? Well, all round, I think they have an incredible amount of playstyles, only really second to the Empire in the different ways you can go. You have giant monsters, you have decent cavalry, you can skirmish, you can kite, you can go box build if you want. You can do a little bit of everything. Even an air corps is possible with the mighty Lizardmen, and this is a big boon to them on the tier list. Flexibility is very important when it comes to how I'm ranking this system and how they fare in different matchups. All round though, speaking of matchups, they do struggle up against a certain type of enemy, and that is an enemy who can turtle build. And that's because the Lizardmen, for the most part, are relatively slow. The only fast units they have are flyers in the form of Pterodon Riders, and all round they don't have the biggest punch when it comes to infantry in dragging their way through enemies quickly. You come up against a Dwarf Turtle build or a Vampire Coast Turtle build, it's going to take you a long time to grind through that formation and get into the back line, because a lot of your heavy hitters monsters are heavily armoured, all those armour-piercing missiles and guns are going to be absolutely slaughtering you as you try to force your way in to behind the enemy lines. So that is a big downside, is their speed, and they really do struggle up against factions who Turtle, Skaven, Dwarfs, Vampires are all pretty bad matchups for them, although not unwinnable either. Overall, I do think they have the best monsters in the game. Large part of that is due to the sheer variety of monsters they have, as well as some of the most cost-effective in the form of feral units. Feral Stegodons and Feral Bastiladons are such a good distraction Carnifex and can push through enemy lines, distract the enemy and bog them down. They also have Carnosaurs as well as Stegodons, who are big, heavy-hitting powerhouses, which come in a variety of formats, some of them being able to shoot from long range. But for the most part, they want to get up into the enemy face and start running over as many enemies as possible. So definitely the best monsters in the game, simply due to the variety of different troops they can bring. Overall as well, I think they have a pretty good legendary lord as well as basic lord choice. Some a little bit memey in the forms of Nakai and Tic-Tac-Toe, although I have come to love Tic-Tac-Toe a little bit more recently. They also have Gorok, the ultimate tank, we can see here in the middle, going toe-to-toe with the mighty Belagar here. They also have Krokgar, Lord Mazdamundi, Slans in general are some of the best casters in the game, kind of up there matching with the High Elves for the most part, and Saurus Old Bloods have always been very good and cost-effective troops. If you want to go incredibly cheap, you can go Red-Crested Skink Chiefs, and they are very versatile, which pretty much sums up the Lizardmen. They can fly, they can go on giant dinosaurs, or they can be incredibly cheap, incredibly cheerful, and go down on the ground and simply, you know, allow points to be funded into other elements of your builds. All round, Lizardmen Lords and Legendary Lords incredibly potent and deadly. Now the big kind of missing factors from the Lizardmen roster, which does pull them down a couple of notches unfortunately, is their lack of long-range firepower. Yes, they have Bastiladons with solar engines, which aren't the most accurate, and you have Stegodons with their mighty great bows, but all of your long range comes in the form of a giant dinosaur, so up against someone like the Dwarfs or someone who's going to box build where you would want to outrange them, you're simply going to get, you know, outranged back and shot down, and it's a lot of value to put into such troops. They also do lack light skirmish cavalry. You have Pterodon riders which can fly, and you do have Chameleon Skinks, some of the best skirmishers in the game all round, but for the most part they do lack that kind of speed and mobile element to their game. So where do my favourite Dino Boys sit on our tier list? So guys, the Lizardmen, though I would like to place them up there with the mighty Greenskins on the tier S, they are going to be a tier B faction, incredibly well-rounded, and I think a very well-balanced faction in the game of Total War Warhammer. So they have a ton of playstyles. They struggle versus turtle builds, of course, because of the speed, best monsters in the game, fantastic Lord and Legendary Lord selection, and the lack of long range and skirmish cav does push them down. Now, if this was a top thematic tier list, oh, you bet you that Lizardmen would be way at the top. That'd be SS++ on that list, and they're certainly one of the funnest factions to play. I think also one of the best factions for newer players to learn because of their versatile playstyle and the fact they are relatively forgiving with a lot of heavily armoured good kind of mid-tier troops and a lot of cheaper fun units you can use that if you accidentally throw away, it's not the end of the game, you can carry on playing. So they are one of those factions that I recommend to newer players who are starting to learn the game all round, and I think overall they sit very balanced in the centre of our tier system. So on to the next guys. Up next, guys, we do have the fearsome warriors of the north, the Norskins, and as I said in the Greenskin little breakdown, Norskins are arguably the best rush faction in the entire game. Only kind of competing with them is going to be the Greenskins, and overall I'd probably tip it just about in favour of the Norskins. They have an incredible amount of light infantry, which is rather quick across the ground, and a ton of skirmishers and fast moving monsters, such as skinwolves, hounds, manticores, which can fly through the skies. They can also punch through a formation relatively successfully with the help of Sea Fang and pendulums and so forth. So overall, definitely one of the best, if not the best, rush faction in the entire game. Another thing that the Norscans 100% have going for them is that they don't really have any terrible matchups, which makes them fantastic in tournament games. It's a nice safe pick. Equally on ladder, if you're a little bit tired of being counter-picked all the time, simply pick Norsca. There's not much they can do to really get a huge advantage over you. Yes, there's some slight favoritism here and there, for example in the Lizardman matchup, but again, the Lizardman matchup is rather debatable. I personally think it's slightly Lizardman favoured, but there's a ton of players out there who tell you it's Norscan favoured, and that really sums up Norsca quite nicely. No matchups swing too heavily one way or the other. So all round, not too bad from them. Equally, they have Skin Wolves, arguably some of the best monstrous infantry in the entire game. These guys are incredibly fast, they have regeneration, which gives them good staying power throughout, and they have relatively good AP. And being this fast, they can counter enemy cavalry, they can swoop in and cycle charge, and equally get into the back line. They are incredibly versatile, and not only do they look badass, they tear apart the hearts of the enemies, often or sometimes in the community called Wind Wolves, because of how powerful they are and how essential they can be to the Norscan roster. So all round, Skin Wolves are a huge boon alongside the forces of the Norscans. Yes, they have Vermeer as well, and who are pretty good troops themselves, but all round I think Skin Wolves really do take the top spot there and help Norsca out quite considerably. The one problem with Norsca is they are incredibly predictable. Earlier I said about how predictable the forces of the Dwarfs were with their turtling. Norsca have one tactic and one tactic only, and that is to rush the enemy and punch them as hard as you can in the face and hope that you punched hard enough. Which does make them relatively easily to prepare against, but equally so, even if you know what your opponent's going to do, doesn't necessarily mean that you can stop it. Much like I've said with other factions, if you're a really experienced Norscan player, sure, there is more ways you can play. You can try and skirmish, go full cavalry, throwing axes and javelins, and try and pull the enemy apart, but for the most part, Norscans only really have the rush for them. But luckily for them, unlike the Beastmen, they're really top-notch at it, and they are indeed the best faction for it. Anything the Beastmen can do, Norsca can indeed do better. All round, they have a great selection. Well, I say great selection of legendary lords. They have two very good legendary lords, but at the same time they are very limited. They have Wulfric, one of the best duelists in the entire game, and Frog, who in the right matchup can be an absolute pesky nightmare for the enemy to deal with. Their basic lord though is lacking quite heavily, and all round they don't have the greatest selection of lords, kind of suffering from early DLC syndrome, where I believe Norsca after Chaos were the kind of like first brand new DLC, as Chaos was released with the base game. So these were the first guys to come into the game, and they do suffer from it a little bit. But any future DLCs, I can certainly see these guys raking up that scoreboard very highly. So let's see where I have indeed decided to label the mighty forces of Norsca. That's right guys, Norsca are going to be up there in Tier A, just below some of the big guns. So quick recap, best rush faction in the game, maybe Greenskins is debatable. No terrible matchups, Skin Wolves are Wind Wolves and do fantastic for you. But they are slightly predictable and limited playstyle, and they have some good lords, but again, rather limited. So apart from those small weaknesses, all round Norsca are a fantastic faction, rather maybe a little bit boring to play after a while, because you're going to be doing that same style over and over and over again. But if you do love rush factions, then Norsca is certainly going to be a good faction for you. They are staple in tournament play, you see them very often, and all round they're not the trickiest faction to play either. You do need relatively good micro in some matchups, but in other matchups you can just walk through towards the enemy and try to lawnmower through them as quickly as possible. Marauders, especially the Norscan Marauders, some of the best cost-effective cheap infantry in the game, and you can just leave them to do the dirty work. So all round Norsca sitting very comfortably up there on Tier A. On to the next one. Up next, we have the fearsome and ever-crafty forces of the Skaven. Now, the Skaven come in with some of the greatest ranged units in the entire game. Warplock Giselles, Mortars, Poison Wind, Globadiers are all incredibly scary, and you guys probably know about my opinion on Poison Wind Mortars. I think they're the most powerful units in the game. The sniping potential of Warplock Giselles is also very, very deadly, and Rattling Gunners in the right situation can cause absolute havoc. So all round, fantastic range options for a load of different situations as well. You've got a little bit of something for everything when it does come to range, where range is indeed concerned. Alongside the massive variety of range, there's a huge variety of monsters and war machines. We have Hell Pits, which can go toe-to-toe with the best of them. We have Doom Wheels, which can move forward and run down the enemy. And we have harder mutant Rat Ogres, which are really good for trying to snipe out characters and supporting. And you have relatively cheap and cheerful Rat Ogres, who are a fantastic counter-punch unit to help deal with enemy cavalry. So all round, a huge range and a huge range of monsters to come in, alongside a nice selection of summons, makes the Skaven a scary foe indeed. All round, Skaven do have low leadership, and this is meant to be a big weakness to them, and sure, it is a bit of a weakness, but all round, Skaven suffer from kind of less from lower leadership than someone like the Beastmen, for example, and that's because Skaven will scurry away quite quickly. They have a nice little ability called Scurry, so they're easier time escaping troops, and they will rally and come back to the fray. And because you have so many of them, because they are so disgustingly cheap, it doesn't matter too much because of the low leadership. So all round, it is a weakness, but not a terribly bad one all round. So all round, the Skaven roster is probably the fattest and most bloated out of any roster in the Total War Warhammer universe, at least in the current state of the game, and because of that, they don't really have any weaknesses in their roster. They have range, they have monsters, they have infantry, and maybe heavy infantry is somewhere where you could say they're lacking, but Plague Monks all round aren't terrible, and they do have some really fun Eshin units, which can grind down the enemy as well. So all round, not too many weaknesses. The one weakness they really had before was it was rather hard to chase off enemy troops and skirmishers, but that has now been fixed. You have those pesky little wolf rats to thank for that, as well as some of the more faster beasties they have indeed gained to their roster. So all round, Skaven looking pretty good on every single front. The only weakness, leadership, but because of Scurry Away and the fact there's so many rats that you'll normally be able to kind of bring your troops back, because your opponent is going to be so dedicated to breaking into your backline instead of chasing down troops, Skaven looking scary. So let's see where I have indeed placed them. I'm sure, as you guys guessed, Skaven are going to be tier S, the top of the very top. Fantastic range, arguably the best in the game. Huge selection of powerful lords and heroes really does help them out. Pretty much every single legendary lord but Tretch is, poor Tretch, but all the other ones are absolutely fantastic. Their hero core is so good as well in the form of assassins. Even their basic lords aren't even dwarfed by the legendary lords, who are some of the best in the game. Plague Monks, not Plague Monks, sorry, but the Plague character, Graces, all of these guys are so good with their summons and powerful abilities. They have a wide range of monsters, low leadership, but again, it's not such a problem as it is with other factions, and very, very few weaknesses in this rather fat and bloated roster. So hopefully no more DLCs for Skaven. They're an incredibly fun faction all round. You've got to love the crazy kind of maniacal laughter of their troops and ideas and crazy contraptions, monsters, and so forth. But yeah, definitely up there, tier S. This isn't a video about who is the best faction in the game, but I would say personally, I think Skaven just about nip in at that top spot. But anyway, on to the next one. Up next, we have the glorious-looking Tomb King forces. These Tomb Scorpions in particular are a massive fan favourite of mine. Their models, and in general, the Tomb King aesthetic is very pleasing and badass to look at. But how do they fare? Well, to start out, they have pretty good versatile lords all round in the form of Arkham the Black and Cetra, who can both do pretty good work in combat and at the same time be powerful casters. And powerful caster lords in a roster always are a massive boon. They're very cost effective because you no longer need to get a caster hero, and they tend to be pretty powerful, at least from what I've observed so far. So straight out the gate, pretty good and relatively versatile lords. At the same time, Tomb Kings have very good range, which isn't said for all undead factions, and this range works particularly well and synergizes with the Crumbling mechanic. So of course we have your shop tier great bows, we also have Screaming Skull catapults, giants as well. There is a lot of big burst damage output you can bring to the table. So your opponent, of course, is going to want to shut that down as quickly as possible, but he can't because he has to get through an absolute wall of undead horrors. in the form of, you know, cheap, cheerful skeleton warriors and so on. And these bad boys crumble. Now, the crumbling mechanic is pretty powerful in my opinion compared to standing leadership. Of course, the undead you have to pay for it in other means as well, but if your front line is going to fight pretty much to the death and slowly crumble, it's going to buy more and more time for your back line to get in there and really do the work. So nice synergy between the crumbling mechanic and good solid range options. Some of the big weaknesses, however, for the Tomb Kings are spells such as Burning Head, Pendulum, and Nasty Wind effects. And that's because their low tier troops obviously don't have the greatest stats and health and so forth. So a big Burning Head coming down the line can roast half a Tomb King's army if it hits it perfectly. So they're very susceptible to such spells, and of course they're undead, so they're relatively slow in the infantry front at least. So their Burning Heads and stuff can do massive damage. However, for the most part, Tomb Kings, unlike most undead factions, are relatively mobile. They have some Skirmished Cavalry, Nekahari and Horsemen, and even some of their constructs, such as these mighty Tomb Scorpions, are pretty quick across the ground, and this gives them a nice flavour compared to regular undead forces. And I think all round they're probably the funnest undead faction to play between them, Vampire Counts and Vampirates, and I think that aesthetic is makes them quite an enjoyable faction, a particularly interesting one all round. So how do Tomb Kings fare on my tier list? Let's find out. So, Tomb Kings are going to be coming in a really solid B, very high up in the B tier list though. I did consider popping them up into the A category, but they didn't quite make the cut. So all round, as I said before, they have some very good versatile lords. The basic lords aren't anything special, but they do a decent job. But yeah, Arkan and Setcha really kind of carry that section home. Although, you know, you got to give it to the Grand Hierophant as well. He can do some, pretty decent work. The crumbling mechanic makes them incredibly powerful all round and synergizes really well with that powerful range attacks. Burning Heads and other such spells can absolutely destroy Tomb Kings though, and that's what has brought them down from a tier A to tier B, is it's a really, really big weakness, and I think it means they do struggle quite a lot up against certain factions. All round though, they're a rather mobile faction, and they don't have too many horrible matchups, equally not too many fantastic ones, and that has landed them in tier B, relatively well-rounded faction with a little bit of everything, packed with some of that glorious crumbling on top, makes them a very, very high tier B, just about got their pinky into tier A. On to the next one. Up next, guys, we have the fearsome Vampirates, also known as the Vampire Coast. Now, arguably my least favourite faction in the game. I do kind of like the aesthetic of them, but all round we'll have to see how they do on the tier list. I'm just not the biggest fan of their playstyle personally. Now, for the Vampirates, they have some very powerful, cheap range options. All round, their troops are just so cost effective, decent range abilities. Carronades, mortars, and all these kind of different troops can do some fantastic work. Queen Bess, on the other hand, is a little bit more risky, but at the same time can pay for herself her weight in gold if she gets the right targets. But all round, one of the best turtle-in factions because of that cheap range. Now, this really comes into play once again, as it did with the Tomb Kings, but even more an extent, that they are so good at turtling because they have an unbelievable amount of cheap options. Zombies will hold the line for an absolute age. They have huge HP pools that, combined with the crumbling mechanic, which we've already discussed this video, so I won't go into it too much, means it takes you an absolute age to bust through the Vampirates build and get into that juicy center pocket. And even when you do, those zombies are going to continue to shoot you in the face as they slowly crumble into dust. So once again, really good synergy between their forces, and that sums up the Vampirates quite nicely. Their laws of magic, which give a lot of healing potential and so forth, also synergize with that kind of style of play. Now, of course, Vampirates aren't just the one-trick ponies. They can bring big, nasty crabs, as we can see in this matchup, as well as Mongols and the like, and get a little bit aggressive and in the face of the enemy. But the most competitive way, I think, to play them all round is, certainly to just turtle in and outshoot the enemy. We've just got really well cost-effective troops. So I'm watching this glorious crab eat that poor Eternal Guardsman there. So all round, it works really well, their build together. They do have two terrible matchups, however, in the form of the Empire and particularly the Dwarfs, who can turtle better than them, sit back and shoot them with their far more accurate long-range troops. Dwarfs in this matchup have a absolutely lovely time. But apart from that, the Vampires have some glorious matchups themselves, such as Lizardmen and anyone who struggles to break them down. And against most of the matchups you would consider even, Vampires do indeed have the edge. They also come in with some fantastic Lord options. Luthor, one of the most powerful Lords in the game. He's definitely in the top 3. I'm not sure where he currently sits. You can't really shut him down with Tempest because he has a fantastic ability or item, I believe it is, that he does carry around him, which gives him lovely magic resistance. He's one of the best snipes in the game, as in sniping enemy characters, because he can fly up in the skies, pistol you to death, shriek on you, and he hits like an absolute truck when he does indeed land and engage. Or you can go the Count Noculus route, summon an unbelievable amount of zombies, summoning, very powerful mechanic, summoning Crumbling troops, however, even more powerful, especially if you're looking to defend that back line. So all round, Vampires still incredibly strong. They have been strong since release, despite the fact they've been nerfed multiple times. But do I think they're still strong enough to hold on to that top spot? Let's go and find out. So, despite a few of the slight nerfs Vampire Coast did get in the latest patch, a lot of their units lost numbers, such as the bombers, who were scarily powerful at the time, and handgunners and so forth, have lost a few models, which will hopefully allow them to be a bit quicker to force your way through and into that back line. But despite these changes, they are certainly still tier S, the top of the top. Now, I think Skaven may have nabbed that crown off the top of their head. They had a fantastic run and can still go toe-to-toe with anyone. So to summarise them, powerful cheap range options, amazing Lord options, cheap onion units that crumble, which makes them a little bit stronger than other units which can hold and run away, only 2 terrible matchups in the form of the Dawi and the Empire, and a good Laws of Magic all round which suit and complement their style of play. So Vampire Coast, super scary, tier S 100%. On to the next one. Up next, we have the last of our Undead forces for today, the Vampire Counts, the old school Gs from Total War Warhammer 1. So how do these bad boys fare in my tier list? Well, unfortunately for the Vampire Counts, I think all round they have more bad matchups than good matchups, which really, of course, hinders them, both in the tournament aspect on ladder and just in general. Having more bad matchups than good obviously isn't a fantastic state at all. Now, very good Vampire Counts players who have played them consistently can definitely kind of make those bad matchups slightly more even, such as up against Lizardmen and the standard blob builds, which tend to be relatively good up against the Vampire Counts, but it is still an absolute grind and struggle, and grind and struggle pretty much sums up the Vampire Counts forces in general. Now, they have very powerful healing potential, probably the best healing potential of all forces. They're kind of the old school guys of the Invocation from the Heck and so forth. They have a ton of undead and filthy zombies as well, who can bog down the enemy while you heal up your key troops to do the real damage all round. So that is one thing they do have going for them, is very powerful healing, and of course they have the Crumbling mechanic, like the previous 2 Undead factions we've already spoken about, and because it's combined with healing, it is even more powerful and abusive than a faction like the Tomb Kings, but less powerful than the Vampirates, because you're not trying to hold back the enemy and allowing all your long range to really shoot in. You're trying to hold back the enemy so your more elite units can deal the damage, as well as your Mortis engine effects. And Mortis engines are a huge boon in general. Anything which heals nearby troops or slowly pulls the life force from the enemy is absolutely massive, and it really suits the Vampire Counts playstyle. So Corpse Cards and Mortis engines in general are a massive boon, in my opinion, to their forces, and really help out the Vampire Counts considerably when thing they would otherwise struggle with quite badly. All round, I think they have a really good Lord selection. This again is something that I think they have over a lot of other characters. Or other factions, sorry. And that is because their basic lords are amazing in general. You've got such a wide variety of different vampire lords to suit different situations. It gives them some much needed versatility, because apart from their lord options, they're pretty predictable Vampire Counts. You're going to be grinding, and that's all you're going to be doing. Grinding on some undead booty all day, trying to beat them down. But their lords give them some much nice kind of switch up and fresh air into their build. You can go with Flying Lords on Dragons, you can go with Corpse Cart Lords, you can go with Vlad von Karstein. You can go for a different, whole load of different lords, which is really some good fun. And I've been enjoying Vampire Counts a load more recently, having experimented with a few more of their lord options. Unfortunately, they're slow, they're predictable, and they really cannot compete with mobility. The best thing you have going for you in that aspect is Vargeist and Fellbats, and even they're not, the most elite. Fellbats are more used to kind of hunt down troops and annoy back lines rather than actually competing with mobility. Obviously, having no range or anything really is going to hinder the Vampire Counts in that aspect as well. They're kind of used to getting kited and pulled apart, but at the same time, they have that healing and durability to try and hold in there. But again, the lack of good matchups really is going to push them down my list quite heavily. So let's have a little look and see where they did land on the list. So, Vampire Counts just about clinging on to that C tier. I'm feeling in a generous mood. I think I did this with a faction early on as well. On a bad day, I probably would put Vampire Counts in the D list, but just for now, they are clinging on desperately to the very bottom of the barrel of the C tier. They have more bad matchups than good, which is the main reason that I was considering putting them down in the D section. But they do have powerful healing and crumbling mechanics, which is really well supported by a great selection of lords, as well as the Mortis engine effect. Unfortunately, they're horrendously slow, very predictable, and can't compete with mobility at all. They can even struggle to compete in the air game against many factions as well. So against the Vampire Counts, it's going to be a slow grind. We're either up against even more grindiness, a large contingent of cavalry, or an air corps. So it's a little bit of a throw of a dice, which sometimes can favour the Vampire Counts, and other times the battle can be over before it's even begun, which is a little bit unfortunate for them and makes them a little bit of a risky pick overall in the tournaments. So that is why they're going to be down in the very bottom of Tier C. On to the second to last faction. Here we have the fearsome and ferocious forces of the Warriors of Chaos, the very first DLC in the game. So how have they fared as time has gone on? Let's find out. Well, unfortunately for the Warriors of Chaos, they have very limited range options. As we can see, they do have the mighty Hell Cannon, which is pretty damn expensive. So if your opponent has brought anything to snipe it out, it can be pretty risky. Apart from that, they have to rely on Roller Horsemen and Horse Masters, who though are pretty good, don't really make up for the lack of any other basic range tools. No real artillery apart from the Hell Cannon, and no ground troops either, such as archers, which most other factions at least have a basic unit of. So that certainly puts the Warriors of Chaos on the back foot slightly, as it makes them a little bit more predictable. Warriors of Chaos, however, to make up for that, are a fantastic rush faction. But they are in the shadow of the Norskins and Greenskins, who do it far better than they can. But still, Chaos Spawn rushes are very common, considered pretty good as well. Or you can go with a load of glorious Dragon Ogres, Dragon Ogre Shagoffs, big Monster Mash rushes, supporting Marauders. Again, pretty common and been a staple in the game for a long time. So very good at rushing, but not quite as good as the best rushers in the game. They have some great legendary lord options in my opinion. I think in this battle up in the skies we actually have a basic lord who can do pretty well, but overall the gigantic chicken, Archaon, Kolek, Sigvald, they're all very competitive. Some of the best lords who have held up really well over time, especially the new buffs to Sigvald have made him far more competitive than he was before. Kolek and Archaon have always been relatively good, big damage dealers, and big fan of Archaon all round, being both a great duelist and caster at the same time. So all round, legendary lords very good. As far as basic lords, lacking on variety, but I do like the caster lords all round, and their hero selections are pretty deadly. Having characters, especially exalted heroes, flying around on manticores is certainly no joke whatsoever. So a good selection of lords and heroes. They have nice elite infantry in the form of Chosen, and I'm interested to see how Chosen with halberds now perform with recent changes to them. But Chosen with great weapons and basic Chosen have been very competitive for a long time, so very good heavy infantry options. However, the problem with that is it's both a strength and a weakness. Heavy infantry in general doesn't perform particularly well in Total War Warhammer, so relying on it can be a bit of a downside as well, although Chaos do it better than most. But still, it's a big boon, but not as big as, being the best cavalry in the game or the best range in the game would be, but very decent elite infantry options. Unfortunately for the Chaos, something they do suffer from, which is going to push them down quite a lot on this list, is they don't have the greatest matchups all round, bar Dawi, which is a good kind of big boon for them, which I think they favour quite heavily. Apart from that, no other matchups really stand out to me where they perform exceptionally every single time, so I have to see how that does affect them. And as you see, guys, Chaos are coming in at tier 3. So unfortunately not having any particularly amazing matchups apart from Dawi, which some Dawi players can take on relatively well, is going to bump them down quite heavily. Also, the fact they have those limited range options, and they are slightly predictable if the main battle plan is always going to be to rush forward, and they're not even the best faction in the game at doing that. Despite this, they do have amazing Lord options, particularly in the Legendary Lord section, and they do have some nice infantry. The basic Marauders pretty cost effective and fantastic elite infantry, but again, that is a double-edged sword, both for strength and weakness. You can't rely on them too much. Big fan of their chariot play as well, but all round they're going to be a high tier C. On to the final faction. And the final faction on our list here today is the legendary Wood Elves, one of my favourite factions in the game, who recently got heavy buffs with the latest DLC. Now before that DLC, I would have put Wood Elves down with the Beastmen, despite the fact I love them a lot. They're incredibly predictable, but let's see what the new units have done to change that all round. So Wood Elves are still the ultimate glass cannons, incredibly hard hitting, but very fragile at the same time. Being incredibly mobile does help with this. Hopefully you can get into the right positions, but they are a tough faction to use, and I certainly would not recommend Wood Elves to beginners. But this is a tier list, looking at how, players in general, both elite players and tournament players, can handle Wood Elves, and if you can use them well, glass cannons are absolutely amazing. But at the same time, it is a downside being pretty squishy, as all elf factions are, but the Wood Elves take it to new levels. They're probably the most mobile faction in the game, coming in with Glade Riders with Hagbane tips, a load of flying units in the form of Hawk Riders, Glade Riders, Wildwood Riders, Great Stag Knights. They've got an incredibly mobile core all round, which really does help them out considerably. They arguably have the best archers in the game as well, coming in with the mighty Waywatchers. Now, Waywatchers have been nerfed slightly, their accuracy has gone down and their price has gone up, but despite this, they are still the best snipers in the game, and the old school combos of netting a troop down and then hitting them with the Waywatchers is still completely viable. Very good in tournament play, and can still be incredibly frustrating to go up against. Wood Elves so good at that skirmish core. Overall, they have a very powerful variety of legendary lords, characters and heroes, some of the best in the game now considering the new changes. RL is arguably the best hero in the game as of this moment, and Glade Captains do pretty good stuff all round. A nice variety of legendary lords. You get Durfu, that heavy tank, Orion, fast moving heavy hitter, gives you some nice options as well. They arguably have the greatest basic lord in the form of the Glade Lady. Her synergy with her force really makes her stand out above the rest of the basic lords. The net ability, Pravenath Rama, is deadly powerful, and that old combination, of course, as I said earlier, with the Waywatchers works like an absolute charm. Unfortunately for the Wood Elves though, they have a very mixed bag of matchups. Some fantastic matchups like against the Beastmen, where you can simply out-kite them and then use a powerhouse like Durfu and some Treekin to beat down what remains of the haggard enemy. Equally, they have some dreadful matchups. You do not want to face Dawi at any cost with the forces of the Wood Elves. It is incredibly hard to win, and so is the Bretonnian one. Particularly the Dwarf matchup with two players of equal skill, I see it being nigh on impossible for the Wood Elves to win, and that is going to be a big factor on where I place them on this list. Is some matchups for them are just downright disgusting, which makes them very risky as a first pick in the tournament scene or on ladder. There's plenty of factions which can counterpick you pretty scarily. So the Wood Elves, let's see where they do land. And here we go, guys, and this may surprise some of you because of the amount I bigged them up, but Wood Elves are going to be coming in at tier B. Probably at the very height of tier B, and you'll notice a lot of factions are in this rough section. But, that's mainly due to the well-balancing of the game all round. So they're the ultimate glass cannons, incredibly mobile, best archers in the game. Those three obviously combine really nicely and have a very powerful variety of characters, both heroes, lords, and legendary heroes, in fact. But the very mixed matchups really drags them down quite heavily. I was considering popping them into tier A, but due to how risky they can be in certain situations, I think most part they have to be probably the peak of tier B. Just got their hands clawing and tickling at tier A all round. So let's have a nice little look now at the overall list. And here it is, our final stand-ins. So in the top we have Greenskins, Skaven and Vampirates. I think that's pretty undeniable. Perhaps some of you disagree with me. And I think we have some more controversial points lower down. But all round, I think those top three are certainly the strongest in the game. Do you agree with me? Do you not? I'm sure you guys will let me know down below. But apart from that, of course, you have Norsca in A, and then B and C is really where it's at. B in particular has a ton of factions: Wood Elves, Dwarfs, Empire, High Elves, Lizardmen, Tomb Kings. Most of these factions either have a very balanced schedule. In fact, they don't have too many terrible matchups, but not too many great ones. Or they're the polar opposites, the Wood Elves and the Dawi. Very good matchups on one hand, very poor on the other, making them relatively balanced. In Group C, we do have Bretonnia, Dark Elves, Vampire Counts, and Chaos, who tend to have the least favourable matchups all round, despite having some good ones as well. Vampire Counts and Dark Elves, very lucky I'm in a festive mood and not dropping them down to the D rank. I think Dark Elves probably the most likely to drop down out of all of them. I'm sure that's going to be the most controversial opinion. A lot of people think Dark Elves are very top tier competitive, but I think they have some really glaring weaknesses, particularly in the skirmish game, which drags them down and makes them slightly predictable. Unfortunately, at the very bottom is Beastmen. Now, I could be kind and bump them up to D, but I suppose someone has to carry the bottom rank and hold up the rest of this ranking system, and that is going to be the Beastmen. I certainly think they need the most love. Now, this is by no means saying that they are a terrible, terrible faction. There are some players, in particular Flying Taco, Geese Howard, who have kicked my butt multiple times with Beastmen, and Beastmen can be a scary foe in the right situation, but all round, I think, as far as encompassing everything that is Total War Warhammer, they are the weakest faction. Now guys, if you did enjoy this, I would happily do another tier video again. This is my first ever one. So if you enjoyed this type of content, please do give the video a big old thumbs up and comment down below. If you agreed, you thought my decisions were idiotic and my little duck brain is completely fried on bread, and you think Beastmen are the best faction in the game, Vampirates are definitely on a C level, let me know. I'm honestly really interested to hear other people's opinions. Of course, this is very subjective all round, but if you enjoy Total War Warhammer content, feel free to consider subscribing to the channel. We do Total War Warhammer content every single day, so certainly good to get your mouth full with a load of that. If you want to join my Discord, there's a link down below in the description on how you can get involved in the tournament scene, in events I host, and just chat with a load of really cool guys. And if you want to support the channel in any other way, you can. Apart from just liking, subscribing, commenting, and all that good standard stuff, you can support me over on Patreon. There's a link down below in the description, or you can become a channel member. I think YouTube's doing some kind of weird thing right now for YouTube Premium members where you can join for free or something. I'm not really sure, but I'm sure you guys can look into that if you press that membership button. So anyway guys, hope you enjoyed this video. It's something a little bit different for me. Until next time, peace, and as always, stay awesome.